Here's why I'm struggling to do videos right now. I record a video and then I'll say something in it that I don't feel should be public. It's very difficult because most of my things right now have to deal with human conflict with a parent or my ex or and all of these things, and I'm not the kind of person who talks about other people. Sometimes we have to, just because it's like really a lot of pressure, and it's difficult for me because all of my issues tend to be revolving around that energy that I'm getting from someone, homophobic comments, whether they were intended or not. Just the fact that I'm here, haven't felt like myself, like I'm accepted for who I am, exactly as I am. It's always something, it's not just about the fact that I'm drawn to the same gender. It's about everything. You're too artsy, you're not conventional enough, you're too out there, you're gay, you aren't Christian enough, you too skinny, or you're not broken enough, you're not crying enough. And I'm just trying to just keep it together, trying to be all things for all people in a place where I'm not comfortable at all, still living out of suitcases. Extremely grateful, yes. I'm grateful that right now there's a washer and a dryer down there in my parents' house and I can wash my clothes. I'm grateful that I can take a hot bath if I want to. Those are all cool things. I'm also going through a ton of culture shock. In fact, I started writing a thing called Culture Shock Is, and honestly, it's not organized, but I feel as if I should read this to you. Culture shock is freezing all the time because the air conditioner is too cold. Having to move to a different restaurant because we were freezing in the current restaurant, and so we moved to one where we could eat outside. Thank you, friends, who took me to a different restaurant. I didn't eat. I just watched because I don't have the ability to eat out. Culture shock is being overwhelmed with the amount of water in swimming pools. Culture shock is teaching my children about seasons: summer, winter, spring, autumn. I didn't think I even got those in order. Culture shock is unlimited internet and children glued to tablets. Culture shock is cars beeping at me the whole time because I forgot to put my seatbelt on. Culture shock is walking around the car in circles trying to figure out which side the steering wheel is on. Culture shock is driving on the wrong side of the road, which is the right side of the road, and feeling very vulnerable. Culture shock is instant coffee. Culture shock is coffee makers everywhere. Culture shock is perfect teeth, huge apples, expensive mangoes, avocados, and papayas that are too expensive because we get those cheaply in Kenya. Culture shock is discovering delicious cherries. Culture shock is plastic bags. Culture shock is the suffocating heat and humidity. Culture shock is feeling wet when you go outside and being chilled to the bone by that moisture when you hit air conditioning. Culture shock is stifling energy from Bible Belt Christians. Culture shock is parents who can't understand that I can love a third world nation and love living out in the bush and love my home, even though America is great. Culture shock is Trump. Culture shock is guns. Culture shock is seeing shootings. 2 in less than 24 hours. Culture shock is being felt as if I am being anti-American by saying that that is not okay. Culture shock is giant trucks with obnoxious engines that are so loud they rattle me to my bones. Culture shock is foamy soap. Culture shock is seat heaters in cars that warm my bum while my torso is freezing. Culture shock is automatic toilets that scare the crap out of me. They flush more times than I need. Culture shock is flatland. Culture shock is highways that look like spaghetti. Culture shock is more than 2 lanes of road. Culture shock is street signs, mailboxes, postmen, Amazon Prime, Alexa, Pandora. Culture shock is microwaves and toasters. Culture shock is washing machine, and dishwashers that I cannot figure out. Culture shock is hard soap that goes in the dishwasher. Culture shock is a dryer instead of a clothesline. Culture shock is people looking at their watches when they ring attached to their cell phone. Culture shock is landline telephone that ring too loudly. Culture shock is feeling guilty for taking a bath because you're wasting so much water. Culture shock is being hurt by the pressure of the shower and being overstimulated. Culture shock is getting annoyed when someone carries on a conversation while letting the water run as they pause while washing dishes or washing their hands. Culture shock is being in a constant state of anxiety because the air conditioner is always coming off and on and the sound is very unpredictable and annoying. Culture shock is being overwhelmed by the number of choices at the grocery store. Culture shock is getting lost in Walmart. Culture shock is being overwhelmed at the number of white people around. Culture shock is walking up to a black man and automatically wanting to speak Kiswahili. Culture shock is wearing shorts in public and trying to feel okay with it. Culture shock is finding the toilet paper entirely too thick and too strong. Culture shock is Amazon Prime. Culture shock is having the mail delivered to your door. Culture shock is having people come over or pull up in the driveway. Culture shock is dogs in the house. Culture shock is getting car sick because the roads are too smooth. Culture shock is fancy cars with drone-like cameras that can see all around them. Culture shock is everything is electronic. Culture shock is electric stovetops. Culture shock is gas piping in the houses. Culture shock is fake fire. Culture shock is missing fire. Culture shock is having so many food choices that you just decide you're not going to choose at all. So you just stick to potatoes because it's safe. No, not safe because I eat a lot of things, but people put meat in everything. So culture shock is meat and vegetables. Culture shock is bacon and everything. Culture shock is real maple syrup. Culture shock is being afraid to flush the toilet because it's too loud. Culture shock is wanting to hide under a blanket. Culture shock is being angry with the amount of pavement and concrete there is everywhere. It extends even into our nature parks where you also are fenced. The nature is fenced off and you can't even touch the trees. Everything is too perfect and too pretty. Culture shock is extremely bright colors and perfect fruit. Culture shock is finding that the food has been modified to a point where you can see the difference between a sweet potato you get in Kenya and a sweet potato you get here, and it just comes off the skin because it's been modified to make it easier for you. Culture shock is food color in everything. Food color in pickles, food color in cheese, food color in meat, food color in drinks. Culture shock is iced cold tea. Culture shock is no hot tea. Culture shock is missing my friends, especially the little old ladies from the Women's League. Culture shock is thinking you're seeing zebra or baboons in the distance when it's only a cow. Culture shock is daylight at 8 p.m. and wondering what time it is when the sun usually goes down at 6. Culture shock is aching for home and no one understanding that even though this is the great United States, it's not home. Culture shock is tasting all of the chemicals in the food. I can taste tinned food in a heartbeat. Culture shock is being overwhelmed by the perfumes and sticky smells that everyone puts on their bodies and in their wash in their clothes. Culture shock is my children meeting their grandparents for the first time and learning to respect and love them as that deep member of a family Culture shock is still not finding where I belong. Culture shock is walking in a constant state of anxiety. Culture shock is finding medicine costs $250 for something that would cost maybe $10. Culture shock is buffets and unlimited food and unlimited trash. Culture shock is me trying to breathe. Culture shock is missing my horses. Culture shock is missing my trees. Culture shock is expecting to come to a place where I could find other people like me and ending up in an area of the world where it is full of conservatives who think I'm evil. Culture shock is the chiming of clocks as they tick-tock and remind me that every minute is another minute that's gone by where I'm not where I want to be. Culture shock is having only virtual friends. You can see my shoulders are so high. That's because I'm tense. Culture shock is me living out of a suitcase with nothing to ground me, nothing that feels like home. But I have to try to remind myself to connect to memories of my childhood, perhaps music and things. Right. Culture shock is listening to live music and just wanting to cry because we haven't heard live music in years. Alrighty, well, I think I've taken a long time, and that's a lot of culture shock I'm going through. So, thank you for watching. Thank you for understanding. This is a whole different world, and I'm trying. Don't forget, click like and subscribe.